We've got just one more, and can't think of a better way to end than this category of spirit as well, which we have Pepperdine University representing this third category for today. The project is titled Climate Migration and Faith. With the enormous challenges of climate change come the related ones of caring for climate migrants who are displaced by these extreme weather, rising waters, drought, fire, and the like. Chris Duran is here. He's the team lead. And this project, as I understand it, is the very first climate migration communication and action plan that's actually designed for Protestant church leaders and their communities so that they can be in better position, to help when the time comes. And that sounds like the time is now, Chris. So I would love to hear more.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me just start by describing a little bit of the problem. Anthropogenic climate change is causing migration and displacement through both sudden and gradual onset climate-related events. A sudden onset event might be something like a cyclone hitting South Asia or a massive flooding event in Southeast Asia, while a gradual onset event might be something like massive desertification throughout the middle of the African continent or sea level rise on the east coast of North America. While extremely difficult to predict, conservative estimates put climate migration, counting both internal and external displacement, at least 250 plus million people by the end of the century. While other, likely more accurate predictions more recently have put that number at somewhere between 2 and 3 billion people around the planet, especially as we continue to move towards a 3 degrees Celsius rise in global temperature by the end of this century. It is discouraging enough that most governmental agencies are not listening to the world's scientists when it comes to modeling the consequences of climate change, like migration. But to me, as a Christian theologian, it is even more discouraging that in survey after survey, too many American Protestants say anthropogenic climate change is not real and or believe that its consequences are not severe enough to modify our highly consumptive behavior. That said, this project had the bold idea of getting my students to create a series of lesson plans for a local Protestant church. As I started this project, I realized that no one else is attempting to do this sort of work, at least anything that I could find, meaning that there was no real analog for my students to draw upon. So besides getting a lot of encouragement from the Pando State team, including Eugene, for which I am grateful, I want to say that I'm also greatly encouraged by my students who have been very creative in working on something that appears to be significantly novel. So as we set out on this endeavor together, we took very seriously at least the following 3 challenges. Number 1, anthropogenic climate change is not easy to talk about in America, and it is especially not something that is talked about frequently in American Protestant churches. Number 2, climate migration and displacement is definitely not common knowledge to the average American Protestant. So we would have to do some minimal basic education before discussing the potential Christian theological and moral contributions. And third, we would need to employ vocabulary that would simultaneously not make people feel overly guilty and avoid as much political polarization as possible, both of which we deem necessary if we want to make a positive impact on our audience. So with that as our starting point, we partnered with the University Church of Christ, which meets on the Malibu campus of Pepperdine University and happens to be my current church family. My 16 students, coincidentally all female, were split into 4 groups of 4 and each connected with a church leader. Our lead minister in charge of preaching, who's a male, our campus minister who works primarily with 18 to 20-year-olds, who is a female, our youth minister who works with roughly 6th to 12th graders, who's a male, and one of our church council members, who's a female. Each of these groups were then required to meet for 4 one-hour sessions during the course of the semester to interview their church leader and ask for advice on various issues related to educating the congregation about climate migration. The students use course readings, lectures from my own research project into this topic, readings of scriptural stories through the lens of climate migration, along with their own research to create the lesson plans. The students were especially encouraged to address the disproportionate impact that climate migration and displacement has on women. Before discussing some of the topic areas covered, let me share some of the themes that arose frequently in the building of these lesson plans after my students met with church leaders. From the group who worked with our youth minister, my students learned that members of that group, middle schoolers and high schoolers primarily, crave deep conversations about important issues. They do not want to be dismissed from dealing with critical topics merely because of their age. Moreover, many of them can already attest to the consequences of climate change in their local communities, even if they have probably never heard of the idea of climate migration. My students thus were encouraged to create material that would make them feel involved in the topic, but in an age-appropriate way. In other words, help them see what they can do, even if it might seem minimal to the scope of the global problem. They were also encouraged not to engage in proof texting, but instead help them, the middle schoolers and high schoolers, read the biblical stories through the lens of climate migration. From the group who worked with the campus minister, my students were encouraged to start from a broader perspective of creation care rather than jumping straight into talking about climate change and its consequences. They were asked to think about how churches can be leaders in changing the negative stereotypes that many Americans have about migrants. And they were significantly encouraged to think about how Jesus's depiction as a migrant in the Gospel of Matthew in particular might be relevant now in the 21st century. From the two groups who worked with our church council member and our lead minister, my students were urged to consider how to communicate material that didn't make people feel guilty, but rather motivated them into appropriate action. They discussed how to address a church that can sometimes shy away from seemingly difficult topics because of the fears of alienating people and stepping into topics that can appear sometimes to be more political than religious. They were encouraged to depoliticize talk about migrants by focusing on using language that might make congregants think about being the hands and feet of Jesus and thus connect them to other good work that the church has been doing and does presently. Some of the theological themes that arose in the projects have come from biblical stories like Esther, Ruth, and her mother-in-law Naomi, the widow of Zarephath, the Israelite exodus out of Egypt, and the betrayal of Jesus as a migrant in the Gospel of Matthew. Those themes included virtues like empathy, sacrifice, dignity of and respect for the stranger, and agape love. So, for example, how much are we willing to sacrifice for the other? The story of Ruth indicates a level of sacrifice that was not obligatory in her role as a mother-in-law, or as a daughter-in-law, rather, and should make a contemporary reader uncomfortable as it asks if this level of sacrifice is demanded of us all. Or instead of thinking of Jesus as a heroic white-skinned figure, as far too many American Protestants do implicitly, a closer reading of Matthew and the historical context reveals that Jesus was an olive-skinned, complected migrant who illegally fled to another country. If American Protestants somehow come to empathize with Jesus's position, how do we not empathize with people of color who are displaced around the planet disproportionately at no fault of their own either? So ideally, what's next for this project, other than my students finishing their final drafts and turning them in? Our campus minister has already committed to using the 4 lesson plans created by the 4 students working with her for a class of college students in the next academic fall. Our youth minister has indicated that he would like to do the same on a different time scale. And our lead minister and I are currently thinking through how to best use the material generated for adults in both sermon series and relevant teaching modules, perhaps podcasts in our adult education series. Furthermore, as I've discussed with the Pando's Days team in the past, I'd be interested in locating more funding to transform these lesson plans into something more formal that could be used in other Protestant settings as well. And that's all I've got.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Really wonderful to hear about this project and all of the work. Of course, this is so timely with thinking about climate change and all of the challenges that that's bringing for us as well. So really appreciate it. And I'm sure that our panelists have some questions to throw your way. So let's see, who did I pick on most recently? Maybe we start with Steve. I don't think we've started with Steve for a bit.
Thank you. So no, I think this is really interesting. When it comes to climate, we do a lot of behavioral work on, whether it's just turning off a light switch, turning down your water. And I think it's this idea of empathy that is really, really important. You know, putting yourself in that situation, understanding how climate change is really impacting so many of our lives, and you know, personalizing that message. So I think the question is I think this is a really successful model that you're doing, looking at particularly migrants. Are you looking at perhaps other types of climate emergencies and climate resiliency practices?
Yeah, at this point, we're focusing on either internally or externally displaced folks because of the magnitude of that. With I said the conservative number by the World Bank and others is about 250 million, but there's a lot of world government agencies, including the U.S. military and others, who think that number is probably going to be closer to 2 to 3 billion people around the planet. So we focused on less of, well, we did do a couple of modules in class about how, if you were to like meet with a local governmental official like the Malibu City Council, or we did a module with like if you met with the state governor, what would you say in order to prepare for those kinds of folks to come to our borders, and particularly looking at the disproportionate amount that is likely to be women and children, and what would it mean to set up shelters or semi-permanent dwellings for people with those particular needs that are often not predicted or modeled in emergency kinds of settings. So looking again at the disproportionate impact, not just on women that climate change has, but then when they flee to another country or within their own home country, trying to understand what would it look like to plan for that more effectively rather than to be incredibly reactive, which most world governments unfortunately are when it comes to these sorts of events.
Great, thank you so much.
Chris, let's turn it to you, and then we'll end with Cassie.
Yeah, thank you. This was really, really interesting to learn about. I think similarly, I am thinking about sort of applicability across different scales of impact, right? So definitely climate migration, international climate migration, huge there's a lot to contemplate, and we're just beginning to sort of scratch the surface as a international society. But then there's also just considering domestic impacts of climate change. And so we do have domestic migration. We also have just the reality that a lot of people will choose to stay in place. We can look to New Orleans after Katrina and really just sort of the attachment to place and wanting to be there even despite climate change challenges, and what might we be able to start thinking about in our relations with other people on an individual level, at larger societal levels, where we can also look out for our vulnerable neighbors as well, and how might that be addressed?
Yeah, we talked a little bit. I mean, there's no sort of one size fits all solution to this, but we did look at different models of what's often called strategic managed retreat, and why some communities are interested in that and other communities are absolutely not interested in that. There's a well-documented case in Imperial Beach down in San Diego of a town that was running out of money to build seawalls and to clear plumbing based on sea level rise. And just the introduction of the term strategic retreat caused city council members to take on very angry citizens, because the idea was we were giving up. So, there's not just a rhetorical challenge, but a sense of, people's connection to place can change the way that we think about this. So we did have a small module on the fact that we often think about this internationally, but that Americans are starting to move due to climate related issues, but oftentimes it is more wealthy Americans who have the choice to move. So we see this now, people leaving, wealthy folks leaving California for a second or third home somewhere else that has water, rather than staying in a drought-stricken place, or like, for example, where I'm at, where it burns all the time. And so I think there's some dots that we were trying to connect, that it's easy to think about this as an international issue only, but yet at the same time, it is incredibly domestic, but we don't like to see it as that. We don't like to see Florida being constantly overrun by hurricanes, or New Orleans. Actually, the first group of quote unquote climate refugees is in the state of New Orleans. The Obama administration gave $45+ million to a group to move only 30 miles. And that was just one group of indigenous folks who happened to be pushed out of Oklahoma during the Trail of Tears and then went to New Orleans and then, so we have these kinds of situations happening here in the States, and we're just not recognizing them for what they are.
Great, thank you. Chris and Steve, you already asked some such thoughtful questions. I was definitely thinking along those same lines because this is very local and very relevant, obviously, to what's happening here. So what other types of, and you touched on some of this, I'm just curious about some other types of models or organizations that you have either evaluated or have partnered with on this, who deal with migration, whether it's climate related or not.
Yeah, so we're looking into that still. There's a great group called Climate Refugees. Actually, it's an international organization that is one of the few that actually tries to take data on this, because one of the problems is not just the collection of data of migrants just in general, but then the data disaggregation for women and children that is necessary in order to have more gender responsive emergency shelters and things like that. In the case of this particular church group, we looked at its long time, multi-decade relationship with the Malibu Labor Exchange, which is a group here run by a former colleague of Cesar Chavez to help find jobs for day laborers here in the Malibu area. And so the idea that some of my students came up with, and we'll attempt to try some of this next semester, is to think about how do you talk to people who have already migrated and sort of try to build relationships with them to understand why they did. Was it, as our economist colleagues would tell you, it's always all about the money, or is it the fact that drought and inclement weather and weather events cause people to not be able to grow food any longer, and so they migrate as a way to attempt to send money back to their families. So we're trying to look locally and try to understand how different migrant-related groups here, or just our farm workers in general, who tend to be heavily from Central America or the Dry Corridor or other parts of Mexico, to understand some of their stories, which is going to take a while, because oftentimes those groups have very high sense of reticence to talk to not just white folk like me, but to talk to folks who they might perceive would give them over to the governmental organizations if they were to be really open with their stories. So it's a tough challenge, but one that we look forward to kind of continuing to work with.
Great, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Chris, so much for such a great project. And thanks everybody for your presentations.